Good evening. I'm David Magleby, Dean of the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Marjorie P. Hinckley Lecture. We are honored to have with us this evening President Gordon B. Hinckley. We are also pleased to have President Cecil O. Samuelson, a member of the 70 and president of BYU, and his wife Sharon G. Samuelson. Also with us this evening, our Church Commissioner of Education and a member of the 70, Elder W. Rolf Kerr and his wife Janelle. Elder Merrill J. Bateman and his wife Marilyn is also with us. Elder Bateman is one of the 7 presidents of 70. Also with us is Young Women's President Susan W. Tanner and her husband John S. Tanner, Academic Vice President at BYU. We are pleased that all the President and Sister Hinckleys' children and many of their spouses are here. 4 of Sister Hinckleys' siblings and their spouses, as well as 4 grandchildren who presently attend BYU, and I think some additional grandchildren are here as well. We are grateful for your presence and for the expression of support that you as a family have given our college by allowing us to have the Marjorie P. Hinckley Chair in this college. Our invocation this evening will be offered by Joseph Hinckley, a grandson of President and Sister Hinckley. Joseph?
Our dear Father in heaven, we are so grateful to be gathered here together tonight. We thank Thee for this great university and for the wonderful facilities that we have here on this campus. We thank Thee for the blessings that Thou givest to us every single day, for the blessing it is to live in this time when we have the fullness of the gospel on the earth. And we pray for Thy Spirit to be with us now, that our minds might be open and that we might be enlightened by the things that we will hear tonight. We love Thee, Father, and pray for all of this now in the name of our dear Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Joseph. We express appreciation to the Hinckley Chair Advisory Committee, chaired by Associate Dean Renata Forsty and members Elaine Walton, Marianne Prater, Bruce Chadwick, Rick Miller, Rulon Pope, and Virginia Pierce. We thank them for their ongoing support in overseeing this wonderful resource. Much of the work in organizing tonight has been done by Yvonne Romney and Robin Shumway of the Dean's Office. Please join me in expressing appreciation to them for their good work. The college has produced a DVD about Marjorie P. Hinckley and the Marjorie P. Hinckley Chair to be shared with visitors who will come to BYU in the auspices of the chair. We sent, for instance, to Professor Wilson, our lecturer tonight, a copy of that DVD so that he could become familiar with this wonderful woman. Our purpose in creating the DVD is also to acquaint future generations of students with the warmth, faith, and character of this wonderful woman. We'd now like to show you an excerpt of this DVD.
On April 29, 2003, the Brigham Young University College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences announced the establishment of an endowed chair in the name of Marjorie P. Hinckley. The chair is a fitting tribute to an extraordinary lady and her lifelong commitment to the development of the whole woman and the strengthening of parents and children. Wife of Gordon B. Hinckley, 15th President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Marjorie Hinckley frequently accompanies her husband on trips of goodwill across the globe. Over the years, she has left a powerful impression of virtue and kindness with millions of people who affectionately refer to this loving matriarch simply as Sister Hinckley.
I try to make people feel comfortable with what they are and who they are, and let them know that they're appreciated, that they're making a contribution. They are. People generally are good. In the church or out of the church, people are good.
It was in the spring of 1937, as America struggled in the grip of the Great Depression, that Marjorie P. married Gordon B. Hinckley in the Salt Lake Temple. But in spite of economic challenges, Sister Hinckley faced life with the bright outlook that would eventually become one of her trademarks.
Just before the wedding, Dad confessed to Mother that his total net worth consisted of a $150 savings account, and that perhaps they should postpone their marriage until he could accumulate enough to support her. In her typical cheerful way, she exclaimed, "All I was expecting was a husband. And now I had $150 as well." I was thrilled.
When I look back upon our early years, I tremble to think of the little money that we had to live on. I earned a very small salary, but that was the bottom of the depression. A few dollars bought a substantial supply of groceries, and we made it all right. We built a pleasant home in East Mill Creek and settled down and reared our family there. 3 daughters, 2 sons. It was a very lively household, and the mother of those children was the very center of it. She was a tremendous worker, a hard worker. She was always planting flowers, doing this, doing that, beautifying the home, serving in the church in a variety of capacities, and rearing her children. She's been the lodestar of their lives, and they all look back to her as the source of inspiration and one to have a happy time with. They love her, she loves them.
A central figure in her own family, Sister Hinckley has also become a champion for the family both here and abroad. As she travels the world over, the counsel she gives centers on building stronger, happier homes.
Mothering really is hard.
Even at this age.
But it doesn't mean you can't love it. And so I would say to all of you, have joy in your mothering. Especially wonderful were the summers when the children were young and home where I could be the boss. I did my best to keep those summers unstructured so that they'd have time to explore and lie on their backs and listen to the birds.
Mother, over the years, your advice and influence has shaped my life. What message would you like to share with these women today?
I don't know. Don't worry, I've got it written here. My advice is to be the best person you can be. Profound, isn't it?
Although her impact on those around her has been profound, it is Sister Hinckley's sense of humor that many recognize as her most endearing trait, one that is manifest consistently in her relationship with her husband.
We learned long ago that you can't take life too seriously. You just have to laugh your way through.
I love this dear companion of mine. We've been at it a long time, and to her I give all the credit for the virtues of our family, including our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. She holds a very bright spot in their hearts, as do I. And my love for her extends over a very long period of time, and I expect it will go on forever.
The quiet conviction shared by President and Sister Hinckley is held throughout the church that a loving bond uniting husband, wife, and children is one of the basic cornerstones of a strong society and a stable world. Yet statistics showing the disintegration of the family are alarmingly common across the globe. Divorce, neglect, abuse, abortion, addiction. Sorrow and despair, it would seem, are running rampant worldwide. But to the ever-optimistic Marjorie Pay Hinckley, these problems present opportunities to make a difference, with answers rooted in love, compassion, and a desire to uplift others.
Thank you, President Hinckley. for your wonderful example that you and Sister Hinckley have provided all of us for commitment, for love and devotion to family. What a wonderful role model you are for all of us. We are honored as a college to perpetuate the memory of Sister Hinckley through this chair. Tonight's Marjorie Pay Hinckley Lecture will be delivered by Professor James Q. Wilson, the Ronald Reagan Professor of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. Professor Wilson has had a most distinguished career. He received his undergraduate degree at the University of the Redlands and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He was the Shattuck Professor of Government at Harvard University and the James Collins Professor of Management and Public Policy at UCLA. He has served on numerous national commissions and received many awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, an award that President Hinckley also received 1 year after Professor Wilson did. He's had a wonderful breadth to his work, synthesizing knowledge from several disciplines. He has published important books on such topics as ethnicity, crime, urban government, bureaucracy, regulation. He's also written eloquently on the moral sense. He is also the author of the book, The Marriage Problem: How Our Culture Has Weakened Families. Tonight, Professor Wilson will speak on a topic central to the purposes of the Marjorie Pay Hinckley Chair, the topic marriage and commitment. Professor Wilson practices what he preaches. With him tonight is his wife of 52 years, Roberta Wilson. Please join me in welcoming to BYU Professor James Q. Wilson.
Thank you very much. President Hinckley, Dean Magleby, ladies and gentlemen. I have spoken at BYU on several previous occasions, but none does me more honor than to speak on the occasion of the inauguration of the Marjorie Pay Hinckley Chair. I am delighted to have the privilege of delivering the first lecture, and I know that this chair will mean a lot to the university as it moves forward. I also hope President Hinckley doesn't mind that I received the Presidential Medal of Freedom at a younger age than he, and a year in advance, but he may not have been available when I was there to receive mine. Let me begin my remarks about marriage and commitment by beginning where I usually begin, which is with Aristotle. Man is a social animal. He is utterly dependent upon forming and maintaining relationships with other people. A person who has always been truly alone winds up being emotionally dead. Of all of the relationships into which people enter, the family is the most important one. We are raised by parents, confronted by siblings, and introduced to peers through our familial roots. President Hinckley, in his most recent book, has written as follows: "There is no environment more conducive to the development and enactment of virtue than the family." And he goes on to quote a wise man who said, "No success in life can compensate for failure in the home." I agree with him completely. The best evidence for the centrality of the family is all about us. We care more about our children than the children of others. We run greater risks to help one of our threatened children or one of our threatened parents than we do to help someone else's. When we go home, we expect to be taken in. Indeed, one person said the definition of home is where if you go there, they have to take you in. On the sidelines during football games, football players wave at the television camera and say, "Hiya, Mom." Some countries and some people in every country recognize the importance of social commitments, but hope to do it without what they regard as the inconvenience of marriage. They hope to obtain these advantages, in short, from non-family sources. In Sweden, public officials have made it clear that the laws of that country should give no advantage whatsoever to marriage in comparison to other forms of union between men and women, or between men and men, or women and women. In France, a law is now in force that allows a willing couple to appear before a clerk and simply by signing a piece of paper, enter into a union, which, if they choose to end it, can be done without any divorce proceedings. A very liberal American law school professor has urged, quote, that marriage should be abolished as a legal category, close quote, and be replaced by an arrangement in which society will pay for children to be raised by professional caretakers. Her views were matched by those of a conservative federal judge, Richard Posner, who argued that conventional marriages, quote, foster what he called, quote, puritanical attitudes, unquote, and went on to propose that America adopt the Swedish system of favoring cohabitation over marriage because a cohabitation would avoid the fostering of puritanical attitudes. To see what is wrong with these views, whether expressed by the political left or the political right, shift the analogy away from marriage and towards a business enterprise. Suppose two people decide to make and sell bread. They can do so by having an oral agreement, or they can enter into an enforceable contract. If they rely on an oral agreement, when one or the other becomes bored or greedy or distrustful, that person can walk away from this arrangement with whatever that person can carry. But if they insist on a written and enforceable contract, ending the partnership will require the agreement of the other party and the approval of the law. As a result of the power of contracts, marriages and businesses both use them. So also with living together. Men and women who cohabit have only a weak incentive to share their resources and to put up with the inevitable emotional bumps and grinds that accompany a married life. In this country, at least, the data show that a cohabiting couple, each member of a cohabiting couple tends to keep a separate bank account. This means that they keep their personal wealth apart and do not share it. When two members of a cohabiting couple have unequal incomes, they are much more likely to split apart than when a married couple has unequal incomes, or in the case of many married couples where the wife does not work, one has no income at all. In a marriage, we share both our feelings and our wealth, and we know that because we share our love, we share a dependency one on the other. Cohabitation merely means living together, or the phrase I was taught in the 1940s when I was growing up, shacking up. Marriage means making an investment in another person. The difference between marriage and cohabitation is that marriage follows a public, legally recognized ceremony in which each person swears before friends and family and witnesses to love, honor, and cherish the other person until death does them part. Cohabitation merely means sharing a bed. Now, of course, many marriages in this country end in divorce, and divorce has become very easy to arrange in most states. But even in this era of no-fault divorces, it means that they must still be done before a magistrate, and that magistrate will allocate the goods and services that they have in common, distributing in accordance with some formula, such as the best interest of the child or who seems to be least at fault. Couples who cohabit before they marry in this country are much more likely to end a marriage should it follow this cohabitation with divorce. If a family enters into marriage without cohabitation in advance, they are much less likely to end their marriage in divorce. Now, cohabitation may have no harmful effects on some people. People come in a variety of styles and flavors. But on the whole, cohabitation is a risky idea. Cohabiting couples compared to married ones experience more cases of physical abuse, are more likely to be murdered, are more likely to be sexually unfaithful, and are more likely to be poor. Children living with cohabiting as opposed to married parents are much more likely to witness their parents' partnership end. They are much more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. They are much more likely to be poor. Now, that is a dramatic picture which must be qualified by an important fact. Some of the disadvantages of cohabitation that I've just recited result from the fact that in this country at least, perhaps others as well, men and women who live together without being married are more likely to be poor and erratic even before they join together. And so some of the effects that I have ascribed to cohabitation may in fact be the result of two people who are ill-equipped either for cohabitation or for marriage. In this country, for example, 60% of high school dropouts have cohabited, compared to only half that proportion of college graduates. But in other countries, especially in Scandinavia, cohabitation has become a common way for men and women from upper middle class backgrounds and highly educated circumstances to live together. They have, in growing numbers, rejected marriage. Because of these differences, American cohabiting couples are poorer than those that you find in Denmark or Finland or Sweden. And so the grim news I've mentioned about cohabitation may, to some degree, as yet unknown, be ascribed to the fact that these people were different before they shared a room. But the selection effect in this country must be becoming less important. Every year we have fewer and fewer poor people, and every year we have more and more cohabiting couples. In 2002, there were 5 million cohabiting couples, up from 500,000 30 years earlier. Even though we have fewer poor people and more cohabiting ones, the tendency I suggest that is implied by these data is that a higher and higher fraction of cohabiting couples have problems because of the fact they are cohabiting and not simply because they enter that relationship with prior disadvantages. The deleterious effects of cohabitation, whatever they may be, are lost on many American young people. In a survey, 6 out of 10 high school seniors think it is usually a good idea for a couple to live together before getting married, because by cohabiting, they will find out whether they really get along. In 1985, about half of all Americans said there is no reason why single women shouldn't have children. In that same poll, Americans were asked whether it was acceptable if their daughter had a child outside of wedlock. Now only 1 out of 8 respondents agreed. Apparently, half of us think it's okay for other people's daughters to have children out of wedlock, but far fewer of us think it's okay for our daughters to have it. Barbara Defoe Whitehead put it this way: cohabitation is not to marriage what spring training is to baseball. This tension between our libertarian views about other people and our conventional views about ourselves has made it very hard for people in this country to think seriously about marriage. Almost everyone in this country, when polled, thinks that marriage in general is a good idea. They look forward to the possibility of being married. They think, on the whole, marriage is good for people. But 1/4 of all children and over half of all African American children are now being raised in single-parent families. There's one large exception to this dramatic increase in the children being raised by unwed mothers. Americans who attend church weekly, only 1/4 said that it is morally acceptable to have a child out of wedlock. Among people who seldom or never attend church, nearly 3/4 have the view that it is acceptable to have a child out of wedlock. The problem of single-parent families is well known to all of you. It is much greater, I think, than the problem of cohabitation. Indeed, the problem is so well known that even many sociologists now agree with it. I apologize to the sociologists in Dean McElby's school. I know they're the sensible ones, but I've met too many sociologists otherwise whom I have to remind of this fact. The best research that has been done shows that after controlling for income growing up in a single-parent family, typically a female-headed family — you notice men rarely head families when there is not a wife with them — family makes things worse for the child. Sarah McClanahan of Princeton University and her colleague Gary Sandifer published a book a few years ago from the Harvard University Press called Single-Parent Children, and examined in detail the results of 5 major longitudinal studies that have been done in this country of how people grow up. These are the 5 most important studies we now have. And in doing so, they concluded that both poverty and being raised in a single-parent family create costs for the child. After controlling for income, they found that about half the harmful effects that children experience result from growing up in a single-parent family, and that is true of all American ethnic groups. After holding income constant, boys in father-absent families were twice as likely as those in two-parent families to go to jail. Girls in father-absent families are twice as likely as those in ones in married families to have an out-of-wedlock birth of their own. When all of this means for society is easily seen in the streets of our largest cities, where gangs patrol the roads and create a disproportionate share of the rapes, assaults, robberies, and murders that our cities experience. And the people in these gangs are people who have turned to gangs in part because they have no fathers, and in a gang they can find what they most need as a young man on the streets of a big city, namely self-defense. We think often of the police as being the principal guarantor of defense in our cities, but that's not quite true. To use a football analogy, the police are the linebackers. The defensive line consists of your fathers. And absent fathers, the police cannot manage this task alone. We have discovered through analysis of data that there is only a very weak link between unemployment rates and crime rates in this country. There is a small link, but it's so small that it is virtually a rounding error in the calculations. But my guess is that being from a father-absent family has a profound link on crime, and the data that I am aware of support this generalization very strongly. If you're not in the labor force, if you are living in a gang or engaging in crime or have no father, you're almost certainly likely to commit a crime. Boys in single-parent families are more likely to be idle than to be in school or to be employed. They're more likely to drop out of high school. And these differences are as great for white families as they are for African American and Hispanic ones. And they're as large for children from relatively well-to-do families as they are for children from disadvantaged families. These problems are not limited to the United States. What we are seeing in the world today, at least in almost all of the Western world, is, to put it bluntly, the marriage problem. There has been a dramatic increase in the last 40 years in the proportion of children who are born out of wedlock, not only in the United States, but as well in Canada and most of Europe. Now, some of this increase that we noticed abroad may be managed by families who live together as cohabiting couples rather than married couples and act as if they were truly married. And these cohabiting parents may, we're not certain yet, act much like married ones and devote themselves to child care. But we also know that there has also been, in Europe and in Canada, a dramatic increase in the proportion of children who are living without fathers at all. So we know the problem they face is not simply whatever problems may be attributed to cohabitation. They are problems that arise because of the non-existence of marriage and the absence of fathers. In Canada and in most of Europe, there has been a sharp increase in the proportion of children living in single-parent families. In 1960, only 1 out of every 10 children in Canada, France, Germany, Sweden, and Great Britain was headed by a single parent. 28 years later, that proportion had doubled. Now, there are several possible explanations for these transformations. One is that women have entered the workforce, and by becoming economically more independent than they once were, they can survive, and in some cases do rather well, with a child and without a husband. These are the Murphy-Brown mothers, about which we once heard so much, but they are relatively rare. Only about 4% of white unmarried mothers are college graduates. The great majority of unmarried parents have either not finished high school or completed their degrees with high school. The second possible explanation is that the relationship between the number of women and the number of men in society. When women outnumber men, as they do here and in many other countries, they face tougher statistical odds against getting married. This is defined as the result of the sex ratio. The sex ratio is the number of women of marriageable age for every 100 men of marriageable age. And the higher the sex ratio, that is to say, the more women there are in proportion to the number of men of equivalent age, affects profoundly the rate of illegitimacy and the prospects for being married. When the sex ratio is high, it is harder for women to find a husband, and in high sex ratios, states in this country has produced abnormally high death rates of poor young men and a high fraction of men in prison. If you send a lot of men to prison, and if they die of murder or automobile accidents while young, even if there's not a war, we will have more women than there are men. And the older these women get, the harder it will be to find a husband. The best time to find a husband if you're a man, or a wife, find a husband if you're a woman, or a wife if you're a man. Let me try to keep this straight here. Is when you're in college, which is what I did, and it was one of the smartest decisions I ever made. The older you get, the harder it is to find somebody with whom you are likely to live. The third reason for single-parent families in this country is the welfare system. The welfare system was created in 1935 to support women who did not have a husband, largely because the husband had been killed in the Second World War or the First World War, or had died in a mining or industrial accident. And so these welfare payments went to unmarried women. And there was a rule in most states that the woman had to be morally suitable, which meant that she could not share her living arrangements with a man to whom she was not married. But after the Great Depression and after the Second World War, the rules changed. And as a result, welfare payments began to encourage women to have children without getting married in the first place. So instead of welfare payments supporting widows, welfare payments began to support teenage brides. For 20 years after this phenomena had become evident, scholars examining it said it had no effect on the prospects of a woman having a child out of wedlock. But by now, good research by economists and sociologists has shown that if you look at low-income women and assess their access to welfare, the availability of welfare increases the probability that they will have a child out of wedlock. Welfare reform is in the air, but as I will point out in a moment, it has done next to nothing to solve this problem. A fourth reason, and the final one I want to mention, is to me, I think, the most important one, and that is that having children out of wedlock or cohabiting with a person to whom you are not married has lost its stigma. We no longer regard, in most quarters of this country, such behavior as shameful. I spent a lot of time in my book, The Marriage Problem, trying to sort out the reasons why shame has disappeared and stigma has lost its sting. And I urge those of you who would like to know my views on this to buy the book, preferably in the hardcover edition, from which I get somewhat larger royalties. But I've given a copy to President Hinckley, not that he needs it. As he said at dinner today, I can't read a book called The Marriage Problem because I don't have one. In the past, this shame was focused on the child, and this may strike you as unfair. The child certainly is not to blame. Why stigmatize the child? Well, this was a way not of trying to stigmatize the child, but of stigmatizing the parents who were responsible for the birth of the child. There have been studies of children born out of wedlock that have been going on in England since the first data were available in the 16th century. And similar studies have been done in many West European countries. This is a study of bastarding. Bastard is a technical legal term in England meaning a child that does not have a married mother and father. And now it has a somewhat more colorful implication, so I will avoid the word and simply talk about children from unmarried parents. I'm not talking about children who emerge from a woman who was pregnant before she was married. That was quite common in England. It was quite common in the United States. It was quite common in Europe. Indeed, in England, from its earliest history on, about 1/3 of all the children born in England were born less than 9 months after the wedding of the mother and the father. But children who were born to parents who were unmarried faced very severe risks. Being a child born out of wedlock, they could not inherit property, and there was no welfare payments to support them, which means if either parent or the one parent, the mother, abandoned the child would die unless it was taken in by a kindly aunt or neighbor. Happily, there were many kindly aunts and neighbors who took them in, but as a consequence of the shame that was visited on the child, the out-of-wedlock birth rate in England remained remarkably low. Until the beginning of the 18th century, the illegitimacy ratio, that is to say, the proportion of all births that are out of wedlock, was about 4% or less in most English counties. In the 19th century, it crept up, but only to about 5%. By the 1970s, it was over 8%. Today, it is 30%. That increase came about because the state abandoned the penalties it once enforced on persons, because it developed programs to support parents who had children born out of wedlock, and because it decided that one should no longer regard this action as shameful. You can see this change if you read carefully the opinions written by the United States Supreme Court. In the late 19th century, just to cite two Supreme Court cases, it spoke of marriage as a, quote, sacred obligation, unquote, or a holy estate. And one Supreme Court opinion said that marriage was the source of civilization itself. By 1972, only 3/4 of a century after these remarks had passed from the hands of the justices, it had abandoned any reference to sacred obligations or holy estates and said instead that marriage is, quote, an association of two individuals, each with a separate emotional and intellectual makeup, close quote. Marriage was once a sacrament, then it became a sacred obligation, and now it is simply a private contract. And for many people, alas, it is not even a contract. Friedrich Nietzsche would not have been surprised by all this. He predicted that the family would, quote, be ground into a random collection of individuals bound together by the common pursuit of selfish ends, close quote. John Stuart Mill may or may not have been surprised, but he certainly was pleased. He had long argued that marriage should be a private, bargained-for arrangement in which the state should play as small a role as possible. But many women who have gone through this experience have discovered that what Nietzsche predicted and what Mill approved of has been for them a disaster. They may prefer cohabitation, they may shun marriage, they may regard marriage as a trivial inconvenience, but then they discover the cohabitation will not last, and their children will be disadvantaged. Or they may marry, but they will quickly discover that husbands often want new trophy wives, and in order to get them will find it easy to end the marriage on the basis of a no-fault divorce law. And when the marriage does end, the women typically will discover that though the courts try to be fair in the allocation of accumulated resources, they will typically be left with too little money with which to support themselves and their children. Human character arises out of the commitment people make to one another, and marriage is the supreme form of that commitment. When we make marriage less important, we make character less likely. Married people are happier, wealthier, and sexually more satisfied than are unmarried persons or are those cohabiting, even controlling for income and education. Married people and their children are less likely to commit crimes. The problems our society and any society faces is the need to reconcile personal freedom, which we all value, with character. The reconciliation is not impossible in principle. This room is filled with people who have struck an appropriate balance between freedom and character and found out that this balance produces a life that is much more rewarding than either the blind pursuit of freedom or the slavish admiration of character. For the good life, mere freedom alone is not sufficient. It must work with and support commitment. For out of commitment arises human character that will guide the footsteps of people navigating the tantalizing opportunities that freedom offers. Freedom and character, again, are not incompatible, but keeping them in balance is a profound challenge for any culture, and it is a challenge that this culture and the culture of most of Western Europe is now failing to make. This war between freedom and character is at the heart of the dispute that now exists between the Western world and a radicalized version of Islam. That struggle is a struggle over how well we manage striking that balance. Our freedom has made the West incalculably wealthy. The lack of freedom has made the Arab world incalculably poor unless you're a military dictator or born into the Saudi royal family. The lack of freedom in most Muslim nations has been a high price they have paid for having denied freedom to their people. But in the view of advocates of a radical theory of Muslim belief, this freedom of the West was purchased at too high a price because Europe and North America are awash in a sea of crime, drug abuse, pornography, illegitimate children, wanton women, and licentious motion picture and television programs. Only as by living in close devotion to the teaching of Allah as revealed by a radical interpretation of the Quran can a culture be holy. But of course, in this holiness preached by radical Islamic leaders, it is the holiness of unequals, not the holiness of equals. And therefore, the holiness of unequals is one which is both unfair and harmful to the women who are subordinated by this culture. This challenge between these two broad cultural views about how the world should be lived is the challenge that this country faces in its foreign policy. This, and not terrorism, is the struggle with which we must deal. Terrorism, after all, is only a tactic, a weapon that people who dislike us pick up and employ to destroy us. But they do not pick up this weapon simply because they like the weapon. They pick up this weapon because, in their view, it is a useful way to bring their argument against our culture to our attention. It is the agenda and not the weapons that should encourage us. That agenda is taught in hundreds of madrasas and broadcast by extremist leaders who wish their listeners to believe that America herself blew up the Twin Towers and caused the tsunami in Southeast Asia. Now, I believe the West will win this struggle because in the long run, freedom always defeats tyranny. But in that struggle, if we are to carry it out well, we must confront our weaknesses, not simply or even maintain or even mainly to persuade radical Muslims that we're decent people, but to sustain ourselves and our own self-confidence. There are some small signs that our culture may be regaining its bearings. The crime rate has dropped dramatically for reasons that have nothing to do with economic success. Crime rates started falling around 1981, and their decline has been fairly consistent since then, both in good economic times and in bad ones. The sharp increase in the percentage of children living with a single parent that began around 1960 has leveled off, and it was about the same in the year 2003 that it was 13 years earlier. The abortion rate among women under the age of 20 has fallen since 1985 and is about the same today as it was when Roe versus Wade was enacted in 1973. The rate at which children are born to teenage mothers has declined since 1991, the year in which it hit its peak in this country. In 2000, teenage pregnancy rates for girls aged 15 to 19 were about 1/4 lower than they had been in 1991. Some of this reduction may well result not simply from regaining our cultural bearings, but from the increased use of contraceptive devices. We know that in 2002, the use of such devices had increased by 1/3 since 1988. Though there's been a decrease in teenage birth rates, an increase in the use of contraceptives, the leveling off of the proportion of children living in single-parent families, this may be the sign of a culture regaining its bearings, or it may simply be a modest and temporary gain. We don't know. I will not in my lifetime know the answer to the question of whether this is a permanent cultural shift. It may be the result simply of the exhaustion of potential victims. There are only a certain number of people who are at risk for all of these miseries, and if society afflicts them all, then the rate of increase will have reached its natural apogee, and it cannot statistically go any higher. We do not know what the answer is, but there are some reasons to think that perhaps we have begun to find a culture that has regained its bearings. Bill Cosby, the legendary black entertainer, made headlines in June 2004 when he called on parents to take charge of their children and for black men to stop beating their women. And he did this in the midst of criticism largely leveled at him by whites, but not leveled at him by and large by blacks. A survey done in 2001 jointly by CBS News and Black Entertainment Television found that 92% of black respondents agreed that absent fathers are a major problem for them. Many rap and hip-hop musicians, to agree, not appreciated by most of us because I trust like me, you don't listen to that too much, you will discover that the lyrics they sing in some of their songs call attention to fatherless families and child abandonment as a major problem that they face, albeit they do so in words that would offend practically everyone in this room. It must be one of the supreme ironies of the modern age that the most vulgar, foul-mouthed musicians we have produced sing words that call attention to our gravest social problems. The worst features of our commitment to freedom endorse an appeal to the greatest threats to our character. There is one additional effect of marriage that may please some of you in this room and may displease others in this room, but in the interest of intellectual honesty, I will report it. Married people are much more likely to vote for Republican candidates than are unmarried parents. And that is true even after controlling for age, sex, race, income, and education. Data analyzed by Democratic pollster Stanley Greenberg, he's an ardent Democrat, though a former student of mine, found that after controlling for every other demographic factor, unmarried people were 1.56 times more likely to vote for John Kerry than to vote for George W. Bush. I doubt that the marriage itself explains this gap. Perhaps it's likely that as a result of the fact that married people are more likely to own a home, have a mortgage, pay property taxes, raise children, and worry about living in a good neighborhood. All of these things provide some support for the appeals that are made in red states. Now, at this point in a lecture of this sort, you have a right to expect that I will lean back and say, having recounted how bad things are, I will now offer you a solution. I will do no such thing. There is no magic bullet. There is no single strategy. There may not even be a collection of strategies that will deal with this problem. Some people want the government to step in and solve it. I recall the remarks of my old and dear friend Daniel Patrick Moynihan shortly before he died. He said that people who believe that the government can do something about this problem know more about the government than I do. We face a cultural transformation, and that cultural transformation has to be altered by ordinary people operating in small communities through voluntary associations and religious organizations to improve matters. Earlier on, I mentioned welfare reform, which confronted the fact, now recognized by most scholars, that the existence of welfare payments encourages unmarried women to have children out of wedlock. And so welfare reform, enacted in 1996, set about a program of persuading women to seek work rather than welfare. And in most states in the Union, it has been remarkably successful in that sense. Some states, such as Wisconsin, are more skillful than other states, but in virtually every state, the proportion of women eligible for welfare who have gone on welfare has gone down and gone down dramatically. But it has had no effect on the rate at which they produce out-of-wedlock children. And if you run a welfare agency or any government department, you can see why. You can urge in a welfare agency your frontline employees to be tough in dealing with women who are seeking welfare payments. You ought to persuade them to find jobs. You ought to refer them to job training programs. You ought to give them lists of jobs for which they're qualified. If you do these things, your success in the bureaucratic welfare agency will become immediately evident. You will save money for the state. You will act in accordance with public opinion that wants you to do this very thing. But now imagine that you're running a welfare agency and you tell your frontline employees to increase marriage rates. Well, now it's a different matter. The effect, if you're successful, will not be measurable. For many years, it may not even be visible. You will not save the state any money, and you will not have public opinion strongly on your side. And so welfare reform has meant that though we have driven down the welfare rolls, we have confronted many children in this country with the following problem. First, you had no father, but now because she's working every day, you have no mother either. And this throws a burden on child care systems, which I'm not sure the child care systems are quite prepared to accept. Indeed, there is a tendency in American politics, perhaps because of these contradictory forces, to shy away from any discussion of the marriage problem. I've long felt that the president and others should use their offices as a bully pulpit to address these messages, and various presidents, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and others have done so. But these matters are easily set aside by things to which we react more ardently, such as an airplane crash. Once the Supreme Court struck down laws against homosexual conduct, many people have become preoccupied with either encouraging or discouraging homosexual marriage. Whatever your views about homosexual marriage, were it adopted nationally, it could at the most affect 2 to 3% of the American population. Meanwhile, cohabitation, divorce, and single-parent families affects most of the people in this country, but it is not something about which we now talk. I think the frontier for thinking and research in this area is to look at the many efforts that are being undertaken by private, in some cases governmental, in some cases religious organizations to solve the marriage problem. There are countless such efforts, the Marriage Savers program, Promise Seekers, various school curricula that emphasize the advantages of marriage. The difficulty with these programs is that with only a handful of exceptions, they have never been evaluated, so we don't know whether they work. And the ones that have been evaluated only for 3 months in one case, or a year in another, so we don't know whether they have long-term effects. And a school for family, marriage life, and social science is well advised to seize upon this problem and see if we can devise a system whereby the many efforts that are now underway can be given a formal and independent evaluation to find out what's working. And once we know what's working, not simply what people claim is working, we should broadcast in this auditorium and throughout the country how these things are working so other people can take confidence from them. Thank you very much.
Professor Wilson has indicated he'd be happy to take a few questions. It's a full auditorium, so I'm going to ask you to stand when you ask your question and speak very loudly, please.
Let me repeat the question. She asked what my views are on incest and how that may relate to the marriage problem. She says that I addressed this problem in a lecture I gave as the incoming president of the American Political Science Association, and indeed I did, and indeed I made it part of my book, The Moral Sense, which I published shortly thereafter. Incest is something of which I think virtually hardly any Americans approve, hardly people anywhere approve, but it occurs. It typically occurs between fathers and daughters, rather than between mothers and sons, or even between brothers and sisters. It is a form of sexual abuse. It ought to be punished. And it is when it is detected. Unfortunately, it's difficult to detect these matters because the girl, as is typically the case, will feel so embarrassed about having been used in this way, she will be unlikely to do it. I think there's also data that incest leads girls who have been the victims of it to pursue, how should we say it, unorthodox lifestyle choices, and to wind up in prostitution or the like. Beyond that, I don't know. That's the best I can do on the spur of the moment. Professor Bushman has asked whether I view the conditions surrounding the resistance to marriage or the personal attitudes about marriage are the key variable, and which do I think should be changed. My view, untested by experience and data, is that you should try to change personal preferences, and that changing them begins in one's own family and in school. William Galston, professor of public policy at the University of Maryland, who once served in the Clinton administration and who has some very useful views on marriage that you might like to hear in this forum, said that you only need to do 3 things to avoid poverty in this country: finish high school, get married, and not have a child till after you're married. If you do those 3 things, only 8% of you will be poor. If you fail to do these 3 things, 75% of you will be poor. Now, that's a message, it seems to me, stated that simply but accurately, that could be conveyed in families, from church sermons, and in school. It's difficult to convey that message in at least large public schools, because the teachers in large public schools often resist any idea of talking about a marriage because it constrains human freedom. An interesting view. I think it can be done in many public schools, and I think it should be done in many more. Okay, she's asking, what do we know about the effects of gay marriage on the children that are raised among gay and lesbian families? We know very little. This view will be challenged by people who support these changes in policy, and they will point to a number of studies. But I have seen some systematic reviews of these studies by Paul Amato at the University of Virginia and by other scholars elsewhere who have pointed out that the studies simply enable you to reach no conclusion whatsoever. They are studies among self-selected people who volunteer to be in the study. They're not a study of a random sample of the population. And to do that, of course, a random sample would have to be very large, since only a very small fraction of people are either gay or lesbian and are raising children. And the studies do not follow the children very long. So as a social scientist, I would have to say we know nothing about that. This does not alter my suspicion about the practice, but it does mean that my suspicions are merely that, suspicions, and not firm conclusions based on documentary evidence. You asked me what sample I used to draw certain conclusions, but now you have to tell me which conclusions so I can think back as to which sample.
Conclusions regarding, for example, the effects of being married as opposed to not being unmarried, cohabitation, etc. You use Scandinavia as an example.
Oh, yes. Okay. I use Scandinavia as an example of a country where cohabitation has become very commonplace among all levels of society. But my data on the effect of cohabitation on people was born entirely from American studies. Yes, there are states that are reconsidering it. Louisiana, for example, has adopted the covenant marriage law, which requires people who are going to be married to go through some extensive premarital counseling and accept other support arrangements. The effect of that law is being evaluated, and we don't have any results yet, but it is also voluntary. That is to say, it's not enforced on all people, so that the no-fault divorce law will be, in effect, suspended for people who sign up for a covenant marriage in Louisiana. And other states are thinking about it, but it is very difficult to do because there is no natural constituency for reducing the divorce rates in this country. If something close to 40% of marriages end in divorce, you already have 60% of the people who are not being divorced and who don't think this is much of a problem, and of the 40% who are divorced, some fraction we don't know, are perfectly satisfied with the result, so they're not a constituency. So it's very hard to get state legislatures to focus on it. More may be going on than I'm now aware of, but that's my general sense. He asks about the tendency of our welfare laws to conceal the presence of fathers. Let me make sure I understand what you mean. Are you talking about the true biological father or a man who's willing to live with the woman?
Anyone willing to live with the woman,
Yeah, right.
drives them away.
Yes, well, the Supreme Court has said that state laws that do that are unconstitutional. This was an Alabama case decided in the 1970s. I'm sorry, I can't recall the exact date, in which the states were not allowed to withhold welfare payments from a woman who was sharing her living quarters with a man. The welfare payments, the Supreme Court argued, go to the child, and therefore the child should receive them whatever the mother is doing. Now, whether that rule is fully enforced in all states, I don't know. I mean, the Supreme Court pronounces on a number of matters, and their writ does not always become practice.
Please join me in thanking Professor Wilson again. Jim, we haven't given you enough reading material while you've been here. Proclamation on the Family, any number of other things. We have 3 books on or by Sister Hinckley that'll give you and Roberta some fun on the flight back to Los Angeles that we'd like to give to you.
Thank you so much.
And we also have a clock by which we hope you'll remember us. It has an engraved plaque that says Marjorie Pay Hinckley Lecturer, 2005, James Q. Wilson. Please again join me in thanking Professor Wilson. It's been a rich treat for all of us to have Professor Wilson here. The benediction will be offered by Kevin Merritt, the director of the BYU School of Social Work. Following the benediction, we ask you to remain in your places until President Hinckley has left the auditorium. We then invite you to join us in the lobby for refreshments. Professor Merritt.
Our Father in heaven, we're grateful for the opportunity we've had this evening to listen to Dr. Wilson. We're especially grateful for the endowed chair that allows people of so many different talents to come together to use those talents for the betterment of families and marriage. We're grateful for the time and the sacrifice and the scholarship that Dr. Wilson has put into understanding marriage and families and his willingness to share that with us. At this time, Father, we'd ask you to help us all that as we take what we've learned here tonight, we might be able to use it in our efforts to preserve marriage and the families, that we might better serve thee in all that we do. Please bless the refreshments that have been prepared for us and help us as we mingle with each other, that we might be able to share the Spirit that thou hast blessed us with at this time. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.